As you may already know, the Denver Nuggets have just completed another 3-1 comeback on the Los Angeles Clippers. And this is absolutely unprecedented, and no one thought the Nuggets could pull this off once again. And you have to give props to Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic, as they were both phenomenal in the last 3 games of this series. And all the credit in the world goes to those two guys, as well as the rest of the Nuggets team, as well as Mike Malone, the coach of the Nuggets. Now, in this video, I'm not trying to take anything away from Denver's accomplishment, because again, it was a historic 3-1 comeback. But I think the big storyline coming out of this series and the focus of this video is how disappointing the 2020 Clippers were. And I think if you watch this Game 7, the Clippers curse, it is definitely alive and well. As in this Game 7, Kawhi Leonard, he would go scoreless in the 4th quarter. Absolutely unacceptable for a player who's considered a top 5 player at worst. And this Clippers team, they absolutely gave up and rolled over in the 4th quarter. And it was a massive choke job, and all the players, they looked absolutely terrified on the court to even attempt a shot. And in NBA history, we've seen countless number of teams come back from a 3-1 deficit, but this Nuggets comeback, it just stands out so much, as in the final 3 games of this series, the Nuggets outscored the Clippers 181 to 117 in the second half of those games. That is a massive 64-point differential, and that is 100% the reason the Nuggets are in the Western Conference Finals, and the LA Clippers are simply not. And in the second half of all 3 of those games, the Clippers, they showed absolutely no heart and no resolve to even attempt to make a comeback. And this Nuggets team, they 100% mentally broke the LA Clippers. And I am making this video only a few hours after the Clippers loss, so maybe I'm still caught up in the moment, and maybe there is a bit of recency bias in this take, but in my opinion, the 2020 Clippers, they are the biggest disappointment of the 2010s decade, and for sake of argument, I am including the 2019-20 season in the 2010s decade, and I am saying that this Clippers team, they're the most disappointing team out of the entire decade stretch. Now, in this decade, we've seen a ton of disappointing teams, one of the most notable teams being the 2011 Heat, and I think there's some striking similarities between that Heat team and this Clippers team. So the 2011 Heat, they came into the year with huge title hopes, being the outright favorite to win the championship after acquiring both LeBron James and Chris Bosh. That's very similar to how the Clippers got both Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, and that was seen as the best moves of the 2019 offseason. Now this 2011 Heat team, they're perceived as cocky and overconfident, thinking they could win multiple championships off the bat by stacking the deck. And this Clippers team, they definitely had a lot of cockiness, and I have no idea where that cockiness and that arrogance came from, as Kawhi Leonard, he is the only proven champion on this team. Patrick Beverley, Montrezl Harrell, Paul George, all those guys, they are not championship-proven players. And that's one of the big problems I had with this Clippers team, trying to root for them. They just seemed so arrogant all the time, and all the antics they would pull, it was just flat out annoying. And I think the Clippers, they were definitely the most hated team of the season, similar to how the Heat were in 2011. Now, unlike the Clippers, the Heat, they actually made the NBA Finals, and they did not blow a 3-1 lead. The Heat, they would lose to the Mavericks, and LeBron James, he would have an epic choke job, very similar to how Kawhi Leonard had an epic choke job in the 4th quarters of this series. I wouldn't say he was bad as 2011 LeBron, but he was definitely in the realm of being discussed, and whenever you're being discussed with 2011 LeBron James, that is not a conversation you want to be in. Now, another team that was very disappointing this decade was the 2013 Lakers, and much like the Heat and Clippers, they came in with huge expectations to win the championship, and they were the title favorites from the moment the season started. And this 2013 Lakers team, much like the Clippers, they were an absolute chemistry nightmare, and they were never healthy throughout the season, and they had absolutely no continuity. And a lack of continuity, that is one thing that definitely plagued the Clippers throughout this season. And even in this Game 7, I had no idea what this Clippers team identity was. They're not a great defensive team, they can't score at will, and their role players played absolutely horrible. So what really is the identity of this Clippers team? It is still unknown even after a full NBA season, and that is in large part due to the team not having any continuity, very similar to the 2013 Lakers. Now, moving on to another disappointing team in the 2010s, we have the 2015 Clippers. And going into the 2015 playoffs, it was seen as a toss-up of who would come out of the Western Conference between the Clippers and the Golden State Warriors. And it was basically predetermined that those two teams, they would both meet in the Western Conference Finals, very similar to the Lakers and Clippers in 2020. And just like the 2020 Clippers, they would play a 3-1 lead in the second round. And both of those 3-1 comebacks, they were sparked by role players. In 2015, the Rockets' comeback was sparked by Josh Smith going absolutely nuts in the fourth quarter. And in 2020, the Nuggets comeback, it was sparked by Paul Millsap going absolutely nuts in the fourth quarter. Another striking similarity between both these teams. And the last team that I would say is one of the most disappointing teams of the decade is the 2019 Boston Celtics. And just like all these other teams, they came into the season with massive expectations. And per usual, they did not live up to those expectations. And I would say this Celtics team, they rolled over in the last 4 games versus the Bucks, very similar to the Clippers rolled over versus the Denver Nuggets in the last 3 games of their series. So that is a look at some of the most disappointing teams of the decade. And the thing in my mind that makes the 2020 Clippers sit atop that list is that they embodied a crucial aspect of all 4 of those teams. They were extremely cocky and arrogant like the Miami Heat. They had no continuity and no chemistry with the 2013 Lakers. They blew a 3-1 lead in the second round with the 2015 Clippers. And they gave up and were mentally destroyed like the 2019 Celtics. And the Clippers embodying all those traits, that in my mind makes them the most disappointing team of the decade, and it's by far. And looking at this Clippers team, all the players' legacies, including the coaches, they're going to take a massive hit. And Kawhi's reputation as being one of the most clutch players in the league, that takes a massive hit as he was absolutely awful in this Game 7. And it was an inexcusable performance from a guy who was in the running to be called the best player in the NBA. And if you look at Paul George, he was simply playoff P in this series. He was absolutely awful. And in this Game 7, he was nowhere to be found, only scoring 10 points. And the person's legacy, who I think is to take the biggest hit on the Clippers, isn't even a player. I think he's their coach, Doc Rivers, as he has now lost the most Game 7s in NBA history with 8, and he has now blown 3 3-1 leads in 3 different decades, the only person to ever do that in NBA history. And throughout this series, Doc, he made absolutely no adjustments, and the adjustments he tried to make, they were absolutely wrong. They were doubling Jokic, one of the best passers in the NBA on the pick and roll, and he was picking the Clippers apart, finding the open shooters, as well as dishing the basket and getting the easy dunks. And I honestly have no idea what the future holds for this Clippers team. Doc Rivers, he could very well be fired in the offseason, and Kawhi and Paul George, they could be gone in less than 2 years. And when you take into account the Clippers, they gave up Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, as well as Danilo Gallinari, and every first-round pick from now to the end of time to get Paul George. That is an absolute robbery by the Oklahoma City Thunder. And if PG and Kawhi walk in 2 years, this Clippers team, they're going to be left in shambles. And I don't think any marquee free agent will ever want to go to the Clippers ever again. And if you wanted to take the optimistic route and try to spin this into a positive narrative, I would say that maybe this series, it brings the Clippers closer together, and they come back next year absolutely motivated and absolutely locked in, and they go on an absolute tear and win the NBA championship. Now in this moment, that seems like an absolute long shot, and if I had to bet on it, I would not bet on the Clippers winning the 2021 championship. But we've seen crazier things happen, and revenge, it can definitely be the fuel that leads a team to a championship. So that is really all I have to say about this Clippers team. They were a massive disappointment and the biggest disappointment of the decade. And as someone who picked the Clippers to win the championship, it was absolutely heartbreaking to watch this team fall apart mentally and have their spirit broken by none other than the Denver Nuggets, who the Clippers were massive favorites to beat. So with that being said, thank you guys for watching this video. I'll see you guys next time.